In 1997, Apple Computer was 90 days away from running out of cash completely. Not struggling, not declining. 90 days from bankruptcy.
Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy. Anybody could tell, gee, there's a lot of liabilities on this balance sheet.
They were bleeding money. They couldn't compete with cheaper competitors.
It's just losing astronomical amounts of money.
The company that had once defined personal computing was now a punchline, a niche brand kept alive by a shrinking group of loyal designers and teachers. And the man who saved it wasn't an investor, a bank, or the government. It was Microsoft, Apple's biggest rival, the company Steve Jobs had spent 2 decades calling soulless and uninspired. Bill Gates wired Apple $150 million in exchange for non-voting shares, and publicly committed to keep building software for Apple's computers for the next 5 years. Without that single check, the company that would later build the iPhone, the iPad, and become the most valuable corporation in human history simply wouldn't exist. This is the story of how Apple nearly died, and the strange, almost accidental chain of decisions that brought it back. To understand how close Apple came to disappearing, you need to understand just how lost the company had become. In 1985, Steve Jobs, Apple's co-founder, was forced out of his own company in a boardroom power struggle. The man who replaced him and the executives who followed over the next decade took Apple in a direction that, in hindsight, looks almost designed to destroy it. By the mid-1990s, Apple was selling more than a dozen different versions of the Macintosh, so many that even Apple's own sales staff struggled to explain the differences between them to customers. The company had also licensed its operating system to other manufacturers, creating a wave of cheaper Mac-compatible clones that ate into Apple's own hardware sales without bringing in meaningful licensing revenue. Meanwhile, Microsoft's Windows 95 had made PCs good enough for most people, at a fraction of the price of a Mac. Between 1995 and 1997, Apple burned through nearly $2 billion in losses. The stock price collapsed by more than 50%. Talented engineers left for companies that weren't constantly restructuring. By early 1997, Apple had gone through 3 CEOs in 5 years, and analysts and tech journalists were openly debating not if Apple would be acquired or shut down, but when. Then, in December 1996, Apple made a decision that, almost by accident, became the first domino in its recovery. They acquired a small company called Next for its operating system technology. Next had been founded over a decade earlier by a man Apple had pushed out in 1985. Steve Jobs was coming back. Jobs initially returned to Apple in an informal advisory role, not as CEO. The board still wasn't ready to hand him full control, and frankly, neither was he. But within months, it became clear that Apple's situation was far worse than anyone outside the company realized. The 90-day cash estimate wasn't a dramatic exaggeration used for a documentary. It came directly from Apple's own internal finance team. Jobs needed 2 things immediately: cash and a signal to the market that Apple wasn't about to collapse. The solution he landed on was almost unthinkable to Apple's loyal user base, many of whom defined themselves in opposition to Microsoft. In August 1997 at Macworld Boston, Jobs announced on stage that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and continue developing Microsoft Office for Mac for at least 5 years. Part of the audience booed live on stage during the announcement, but the deal accomplished exactly what it needed to. It wasn't really about the $150 million. That amount alone wouldn't have saved Apple long term. It was about credibility. If Microsoft believed Apple had a future worth investing in, so could everyone else. For Microsoft, the deal made sense too, though for different reasons. Microsoft was in the middle of an antitrust investigation, and a healthy, independent Apple gave them a useful argument that the PC market wasn't a monopoly after all. With the immediate crisis stabilized, Jobs moved fast. Within weeks, he killed the Mac clone licensing program entirely. Within months, he cut Apple's product line from over a dozen confusing models down to just 4. He was simplifying the company before he had even built anything new. In May 1998, Apple released the first product designed almost entirely under Jobs' renewed influence, the iMac. It looked nothing like any computer before it. Translucent blue plastic, an all-in-one design, no floppy disk drive. At a time when that decision was considered borderline reckless, it sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. More importantly, it did something Apple desperately needed. It made the brand feel exciting again. But the iMac alone wouldn't have changed Apple's trajectory. What came next did. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, not the first MP3 player on the market, but by far the simplest and best designed. Paired with iTunes in 2003, Apple didn't just sell a device. They built an entire ecosystem around digital music at the exact moment the industry was being forced to change. By 2006, the iPod and iTunes accounted for nearly half of Apple's total revenue, a company that 9 years earlier had been 90 days from bankruptcy and was now generating billions from a product category it didn't even compete in a decade prior. Then, in January 2007, Jobs walked on stage and introduced a product that combined a phone, an iPod, and an internet device into one piece of glass and aluminum. The iPhone didn't just succeed. It redefined what a phone was, created an entirely new app economy, and within a few years became the single most profitable consumer product ever made. By 2011, the year Jobs passed away, Apple had briefly become the most valuable company in the world, a title it would go on to hold almost continuously for the next decade and beyond. The easy version of this story is, Steve Jobs came back and genius saved the day. But that framing misses what actually happened in those first 18 months, and it's the part that matters most. Before Jobs built anything new, he did something much less glamorous. He stopped the bleeding. He took a $150 million investment from a rival, accepting short-term embarrassment to buy long-term survival. He killed products, cut licensing deals, and simplified a confusing lineup down to almost nothing. None of that was visionary. It was survival mode. The innovation, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, only became possible because the company survived long enough to build it. This is a pattern that gets lost in most retellings of comeback stories. The dramatic, world-changing product usually isn't the first move. The first move is almost always unglamorous. Stabilize, simplify, survive. Apple's near-death experience also reveals something about how fragile even iconic companies can be. 18 months separated, about to go bankrupt, from building the product that would define the next decade. The line between those two states was thinner than almost anyone realized at the time, including the people running the company. Today, Apple is worth more than the entire GDP of most countries on Earth. The $150 million Microsoft investment that once felt like a humiliating bailout is now a footnote, barely a rounding error on Apple's balance sheet. But without it, most probably none of it had ever happened. No iMac, no iPod, no iPhone. If you want to understand the decisions, good and bad, behind the rise and fall of the world's biggest companies, subscribe. There are new episodes every week, and if today's story made you think about how fragile even the biggest companies can be, I've linked a book in the description, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. It's the same framework that explains Kodak's collapse, Nokia's collapse, and, in a strange way, why Apple's comeback worked when it could so easily have gone the other direction. Link is below.